Well, for more, let's speak to Kamal Alam. He's a visiting fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and joins us from London. Kamal, good to speak to you. So we've heard the feelings of Syrian civilians, but how do you think the Syrian government will be feeling after these decisions have been made in Astana?
I think the Syrian government go along with the Astana peace accords because they trust the Russians and the Iranians to deliver their point across to the opposition via Turkey. So the Syrian government are feeling more emboldened. They've consolidated territory over the last few weeks. And the de-escalation zones are perhaps what might be called the beginning of the end of this war, because for the first time in over 5 years, you have Russia, Turkey and Iran all agreeing on how to end this war. And whilst it might not be perfect, it's pretty close to bringing all sides to the negotiating table and getting an end to this war.
And before we sort of go into exactly what's been proposed at Astana, what do you make of the reason this is coming about now? Is it war weariness, or is it just a sense that both sides realise that neither one can take a decisive victory?
I think it's a mixture of both. There's a war weariness and all sides are exhausted. At the same time, I think one thing has been realised, that this war needs a regional solution rather than too many external players. And I think the US, which was leading the Syrian peace talks, failed miserably. As a result, this tripartite ceasefire came about, sponsored by Turkey, Iran and Russia. And that's what's really been the key for this, that the Europeans and the Americans have failed, whilst the Turks, the Iranians and the Russians have succeeded.
Absolutely. And on that part, that tripart, as you mentioned, there is talk coming out of Astana that troops, some kind of forces will be sent in by each of the three nations, Iran, Turkey and Russia, to make sure that this ceasefire holds. Aren't there inherent pitfalls with the three nations getting involved like that on the ground militarily in Syria?
Definitely there are going to be stumbling blocks because all three sides have groups that they back and oppose. But I think the best way around this is that the Syrian opposition won't be happy with Iranians entering Idlib, because Iran is seen as a very divisive figure in the war. But I think the Iranians also realize that they don't need to enter their troops into Idlib. They can perhaps monitor around the fringes in Latakia province, Aleppo or Homs, whilst the Turkish troops and the Russians can be in Idlib. So there are tricky bullet points in the ceasefire, but I think if the three countries keep talking the way they are, then it will lead to some sort of positive results.
And do you think this could perhaps be the only way of bringing an end to the war? I mean, we've seen this kind of thing happen before around the world. It hasn't always ended well when other nations control other nations for a period of time. How long do you think it could last? And as I said, do you think this is perhaps the only way that the war in Syria will be able to stop?
That's a good question. As I said, the last 6 years, all the things that have been tried have failed. But the ground results are very different now, and the realities also change. And as I mentioned, whilst Geneva has been failing continuously, Astana have been working. So again, it's yet to be seen how successful this will be. But in the last 6 months, there's been a dramatic reduction of violence, and the ceasefires have more or less worked in eastern Syria and southern Syria. And as I said, a year ago, Russia and Turkey didn't talk to each other. Now Russia and Turkey are more or less on the same page. So I think as with those guarantors, there seems to be much more hope than the previous times.